of you know this idiom? The handwriting on the wall. Okay, do you know where it comes from? Oh, you do. Interesting. Well, it comes from the Bible, and we're going to read the passage today. What does the idiom mean? We often say, he can't see the handwriting on the wall. What do we mean by that? It's right in front of our face, and we can't see it. We don't understand it. We can't comprehend or appreciate it. And the idiom is that, well, something written in big letters on the wall we ought to be able to see and get, but we don't. Well, usually handwriting about the loss, usually the hand-wringing about the loss of biblical literacy is true. And we fail to notice, however, how deeply the Bible inhabits our language and our thought. You would be amazed at how many idioms, how many expressions come out of the Bible. And they just get passed along in the language, passed along in the culture, and we don't appreciate how it forms us, how it shapes us, what the meaning is. And the reason has everything to do with this idea, the handwriting on the wall. We are obtuse to ourselves. Here's an ironic fact about human beings. We see each other better than we see ourselves. And if you want to know about yourself, ask someone who's living with you, and they will probably tell you uncomfortable truths about yourself that you have blinded yourself to. Well, we're going to read the story where this comes from this morning. It comes from the book of Daniel. King Belshazzar. Now, King Belshazzar is likely the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, not the son. Even though often it's called Nebuchadnezzar, your father, that was often used of, you could say of a group, Abraham is your father, even though Abraham lived hundreds or thousands of years before. That's just simply a Hebrew idiom. So you'll hear that, and I don't want you to be confused by it. King Belshazzar is also probably at this point the crown prince of Babylon. His father was out fighting battles at this moment, and Belshazzar had a reputation in the kingdom of, as many crown princes have, of being spoiled, of being a party animal, and of being a worthless leader, all of which we're going to see in this story. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. Notice all the repetition. And the kings and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the finger of a human man appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall, near the lampstands in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Now remember, he's the crown prince, so he can only make the third highest ruler because he himself is the second highest ruler in the kingdom. And you can, remembering all the other stories we've read in the previous weeks, this is the pattern in the book, that something is terrible, the king gets frightened, looks for his wise men to answer the question. Now if you've paid attention to the pattern, you know what comes next. Well, the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. This is actually likely the queen mother. "Don't be alarmed, don't be so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him." This was in the last chapter that we read last week, that direct quote. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him the chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father, the king, brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and given a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered the king, You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. It's the story we read last week. He was driven away from the people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and set over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear anything or understand. You did not honor the God who holds his hand over your life and all your ways. Therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. Here is what these words mean. Meaning, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. At Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. I remember learning this story as a kid. It's a great Bible story. It shows up in all the Bible story books. And it makes the point of last week's chapter, which is God raises up and God brings low. And we're about to have an election this week, and some will be raised up and some will be brought low. And we have pollsters and people doing all this work. But you ask Reggie, who works in this kind of thing, do the pollsters know what's going to happen on Tuesday? They're usually wrong. Even Reggie, who at this moment is carrying on a 7-0 season in fantasy football, even Reggie doesn't know if he will win the championship this year. The Lord brings up, the Lord brings down. That's the message of the story. But the handwriting on the wall, what does that mean? It means even we ourselves are so often blind to that which should be so obvious. I want to play a little clip from, this woman's name is Greta Vosper, and she is a minister in the United Church of Canada who a number of years ago came out as an atheist. And she's speaking in front of an organization it's called the Clergy Project. This organization has a project they call the Clergy Project, trying to support ministers who don't believe in God but are keeping it a secret. And they're trying to support them that they would come out and declare that they don't believe in God while still being ministers, and in some cases like her, having a church. So I want to play a little bit of this speech that she gave, and I want you to listen to what she has to say. Just listen to it and see what you learn. Go ahead, give it a click. It should probably launch. There we go.
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you today and to be able to share a bit of the story. I am indeed a pastor in the United Church of Canada congregation. It's not a congregation that has been taken out of a mainline denomination, but one that continues to exist within the United Church of Canada. It's in the city of Toronto, a congregation which this year is celebrating its 65th anniversary. I've been there for 18 years. About 15 years ago, a colleague of mine, while on a Habitat for Humanity build in another province, was caught in a hurricane with his 2-year-old son in his arms. His son was torn from his arms and killed during that hurricane. I heard about that and so went searching on the internet for something about the information that I could learn, and the headline that came up was a picture of a family with a child, and the headline, "God took care of us." And that was the last straw. Because I could no longer use the word God to describe what I meant and allow it to be understood to mean what so many other people mean, the Wikipedia definition of God. My definition of God, since I had been very young, was about love. It was about creating something very sacred between you and I. It was about making sure that I didn't just use people and that I allowed myself to build relationships with them that meant that they would honor my integrity and they would not just use me. It was about trying to build that relationship in the world, a world that was so in need of compassion and justice and caring and beauty. And so my ministry grew out of that, and I used the word God to describe that. But over the course of a few years of ministry, I clued into the fact that nobody had any idea what I was talking about. And I worried about that. I didn't really understand why that was happening. A colleague and I actually had a conversation about it one time, and the next Sunday when I sat down at the front of my congregation and I opened my bulletin, I realized everything I said in that 20 minutes of preaching, during which I did what I had been taught in theological college, where I learned that the Bible was a human construction. I was taught to take the Bible passage for the week apart, to talk about the socio-political, economic environment in which it had grown out of, who wrote it, why they wrote it, who they wrote it for, why the context of that piece had absolutely nothing to do with today. And then I'd find some little thing and I'd, build some moral something around it. But no one heard any of that. Because I wrapped it entirely in traditional sounding prayers. Oh God, in your mercy, hear our prayer. We sang hymns that held up this idea of Jesus that would, conquer the world. And we spoke in language that reinforced the idea of an interventionist supernatural deity that was going to, if nothing else, be the only and sole source of our strength. So I realized that something had to give, but I didn't know what. So I pondered it for a little while, and that's when the hurricane took place. So one Sunday, unprepared, and those of you who have been clergy know that things happen and you don't get a sermon done for the Sunday. And most clergy, if that happens, they've got a drawer, they pull out a file of a sermon they haven't preached in a few years, or they preached at another church. I don't write my sermons, I didn't have a drawer. So the service unfolded, and when it came to the time when I was supposed to preach, I stood up and I completely deconstructed God. I talked about how I couldn't possibly believe in an interventionist God, that I couldn't abide that there but for the grace of God go I statement, that I could no longer talk about a supernatural realm that would or would not in-break into ours in order to adjust natural events, that I didn't believe that you and you and you didn't stand with courage and strength coming out of your own self and not from some other place. At the end of that sermon, I think it was that sermon, was the moment that I realized things had changed forever. I sat down, picked up my bulletin, and realized the next thing, the intercessory prayers. I had to stand and say, "Oh God, in your mercy," and they had to respond, "Hear our prayer." But after that service, I got more hugs than I had ever had in my entire life as a clergy. Not because people were going, "Yes, we totally believe that." They thought I had some kind of a psychotic break. But I knew that I had stepped over a line. And so I met with the chair of my board, and we called a board meeting, and we had the conversation. And I said, "I just can't do this anymore." I thought I was in the middle of a spiritual crisis, but I recognized now it was a leadership crisis. My beliefs hadn't changed at all. I just realized I couldn't lead anymore like that. And so they said, "Okay, tell us what it's going to look like. Where are we going?" And I said, "I haven't got a clue. I don't know." And they said, "Okay, let's go." 15 years later, we're still transitioning that congregation, but I think we've got it pretty good now. For the first little while, people were all on board, moving along, very supportive until shortly after my first book, With or Without God, Why the Way We Live is More Important Than What We Believe, was published. We finally took the Lord's Prayer out. Whew, that had been a long time. We lost 50% of the congregation when we did that.
Okay.
It was no surprise. But
Now, in case you think, I'm going to do that, no. But pay attention to what had been happening. There was this disconnect between, she had an idea of God that was a beautiful idea, an idea of God about people getting along together, which Christianity is about, reconciliating one to another. An idea of God about respecting one another. Well, that's a good idea too, respecting one another. But is respecting one another actually God? And then she begins to realize that all of the language built into church, all this time she has been trying to divorce everyone of the idea of the reality of a God who could come in and write in plaster on a wall of a Babylonian royal palace that a worthless king's reign would be ended because this God picks up and this God takes low. That she didn't realize that even though that was the God she believed in, all of her words were encouraging all of her people to think about a God who picks up and a God who brings low. And so she decides, I'm going to fix this. But what do you do to fix it? You have to take out all of the language. You have to say, there can be no finger writing on the wall. You have to say, well, we got to get rid of the Lord's Prayer. We've got to get rid of... How much do you have to get rid of? Who was her God? Who was Belshazzar's God? You probably didn't notice it because, generally speaking, when we read the Bible, we just kind of read along. But again, because I look for these things, because this is what I've been trained in, you look for emphasis by repetition in it. Drinking wine, drinking wine, drinking wine, the goblets, the golden goblets, the gods of stone. You see this, and what the text is telling you is a lot about Belteshazzar. Well, what was Belteshazzar's God? While his kingdom is literally crumbling around him, these armies just didn't show up one day to topple his government. He had probably been losing the war all along, and bad news, bad news, bad news, let's have a drink. More bad news, let's bring out the golden goblets. More bad news, let's have a huge party. What was his God? Now, the irony of wine and alcohol is that, as we talked about last year, on one hand, it's a biblical image for glory. On the other hand, it's a way for us to forget. When you drink alcohol, it actually diminishes your capacity to see, which is why you're not allowed to drink and drive. Because some people, and I've heard people say, I'm a better driver after a few drinks. And it's like, no, you only think you're a better driver after a few drinks because you're not realizing how bad a driver you're being. But it's part of being obtuse. And it's part of willfulness Because Belshazzar drank and partied in order to not know. The handwriting on the wall says to us, we are idol makers. We make God out of good things that we see. Well, my God is this and my God is that. And Freud came along and said, you know what people do? People make gods out of the things that they value and they project it into the sky. And that's true. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that is what a real God is. Or what the real God is. Because usually it's the traumas of life that reveal the fact that we're trying to obliterate the real God in favor of the one we assert. And we cover it up with wine and amusements and escapism, or whatever works to make us less conscious. Most people have a God of faulty insurance. I will discard the idea of any interventionist God because tragedies happen to some and not to others, and often contrary to my evaluation of the worthiness of divine favor. Bad things happen to people I regard as good and worthy, and that is true. Because if you talk to Mark about the kind of man Willie was, you think if a horrible, painful form of cancer is going to hit someone, it shouldn't hit Willie. Is that true? Willie was a good man, and he was a good father, and he was a good husband, and he did the right thing, and he had integrity. And you think, we need more people around like that, and Willie gets cancer. And it's very easy to believe no good God would let Willie get cancer. That's a very easy idea to believe. But underneath it is the idea that it's the God of karma. Only bad people get cancer. Really? No. Or it's the idea of the God of chaos. There is no God. We all have to make this out of this world what we can. Okay. But the God we really believe in this case, is false. We believe that if I was loyal and obedient, then God would run the world as I see fit. But when events destroy your ability to believe, what do? Well, Belshazzar can't read or see, so he doubles down on his usual defense. There's a hand and it's writing, and I don't know what it is. Money, wine, gold. Here, someone fix the problem. Daniel says he can keep the money. I don't need it. In fact, the high position you give me tonight won't be there tomorrow morning because of what's written on the wall. Greta Vosper always trusted that individual relationships were God. Well, individual relationships are good, but they're not God. What will she do when people fail her? You see, the bad news is this. You are not God. And if you are your own God, you have a lousy God. Because your God can't fix anything more than you can fix. And you think for a moment that in that tragic situation where that little boy was ripped out of his father's arms in a hurricane, if you think for a moment that father wouldn't have done whatever he could to save his son, he was not God. But that leaves us with a difficult question. How will you respond? Will you respond in Belshazzar's way of, I'm not going to think about it, I'm just going to have a good time, and I'm just going to keep my head down, and I'm just not going to... That's Belshazzar's way. Greta Vesper's way is, well, it's ironic, because on one hand she's angry with God for the bad things that happen, so she's going to get back at him by saying, I don't believe you, there. Well, does that make sense? Does the Father know what it's like to see his Son suffer? Not just the winds of chaos, but to the evil of people's plans to improve the world according to their religious and political dreams? That's the story of the Bible. The story of the Bible is not that good sons don't suffer. The story of the Bible is a perfect man is cut off in his youth by consent of the governed, and God not only lets it happen, but abandons his son. When Jesus is faced with what should look like injustice, does he deconstruct God? He cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But he's free to cry out to his Father in pain. He doesn't say, "I'm so mad at you, I don't think you exist." What does he do at the end? "Into your hands I commit my spirit." The main issue here is not information. The main issue here, as it always is trust. Can we trust God even when we suffer? That is Jesus' challenge. I encourage you to face the facts in your world. Don't drink them away. Don't make yourself your own God. If you do, you have a lousy God. And in fact, you don't even need one, because you are your own God, and you'll get nothing more than you can secure for yourself, which in this world means not a lot. You don't have enough power, and your fellow godlings won't be great allies. Trust me. Look at the language. Handwriting on the wall. Where does that come from? It's built into the language. Greta Vosper learned all this stuff built into the language. Maybe she could have paused and said, maybe there's a reason for hundreds and hundreds of years the people of God have been saying these words again and again. Maybe even when we're kind of obtuse and we don't understand what's going on, we've learned some of why this language is embedded in our world. It survived for a reason. And so then what you do is that you wait, and you learn to trust, and you try to believe even when believing is hard. And when Jesus, knowing full well the kinds of things that we would face, what did he do for his disciples? He gave them a prayer. Why? To talk to God. Not to talk to Pete. If I want to talk to Pete, I'll talk to Pete. You sit in the front row, you always get to be the example. What I need to do is talk to God. Well, how should I talk to God? What should I say? Jesus says, here, I'll give you this prayer. Why don't you say it with me if you're willing? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Now, that's the prayer he taught us to pray. But what was he looking at? He didn't deconstruct God for his apostles. He didn't say, well, you know, there really isn't a big guy upstairs, and so maybe what we should do, because I kind of know that later on tonight I'm going to get arrested, beaten within an inch of my life, hung naked on a cross, and mocked by our enemies. Because if you didn't think there was a God, the reasonable thing to do would be to sneak out of town. But on the night he was betrayed by one of his own inner circle, he took bread and he broke it. And he didn't say, hey, you know, the heat's on, we got to get out. He said, this is my body, broken for you. I'm going into the fire. I'm going into the flame. My Father, who I've been more intimate with than any pair of lovers, is going to abandon me. And I'm doing it for you. And you don't even know it. You can't read the handwriting on the wall because you can't even read. But this is for you because I love you. And this is what love requires. That's what he did. That's what he said. Well, why are we doing it? Why do we continue to do it? It's built into the language. We don't do it well. We're obtuse. We don't know what we're doing. But when we take this bread and this wine, not like Belshazzar, what we're saying is, I'm with him. And I'm with you. And even though I'm really bad at it, I too will do it for this graceless world. And the irony of Greta Vosper is that that's what she wants. But she says, well, I can't believe the stuff up there. It's the stuff up there that makes the stuff right here mean this isn't just sourdough from Bel Air. This is the body and blood of our Lord given for you. The table is yours. He gives it to you freely. Will we give to each other and this world? We're bad at reading the handwriting on the wall. And so he boils it down to his body. Take, eat, remember, and believe that the body of your Lord was given for the complete forgiveness of all your sins. Jesus took a cup of wine, not in a golden goblet that was profaned by an unworthy king, but in the meal with his disciples and said, "This is my blood given for you." They had no idea what he was saying. And to us he says, "Do this in remembrance of me." Take, drink, remember and believe that our Lord died to give you his life, to give you his spirit, to make you whole. Would you stand? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you his peace. Amen.